There is a kind of pain that rises long before anything touches the body. It appears in the space between anticipation and memory, in the quiet moments when the mind imagines what has not yet happened or replays what it wishes it could forget. This is the pain Marcus Aurelius understood more clearly than most. A pain born not from injury, but from interpretation. The mind reacts before the world does. It constructs narratives, assigns meaning, predicts danger, and in doing so creates suffering long before life delivers the first blow. Marcus lived at the height of power, carrying the weight of an empire, yet his greatest battles were fought in silence. War thundered at Rome's borders, betrayal festered in his court, illness lingered in his body, but none of this shook him as much as the storms within his own thoughts. He recognized that the world could wound the flesh, but only the mind could wound the soul. This is why he wrote to himself again and again, a reminder he could not afford to forget. Suffering is not in the thing itself, but in our judgment of it. Pain begins the moment the mind interprets an event as a threat. A word spoken with the wrong tone, a glance held a second too long, a memory resurfacing without warning. Before the body reacts, the mind tightens. Before the heart trembles, thought has already painted the experience with fear. Most of what we call pain is the echo of a judgment, not the event that triggered it. Modern neuroscience finally catches up to what Marcus intuited centuries ago. The brain predicts pain before it perceives it. The limbic system fires its alarms not when danger arrives, but when it anticipates danger. Emotional circuits light up before a single sensation reaches the conscious mind. We hurt not because the world is cruel, but because the mind is untrained in separating what is happening from what it fears might happen. This realization is not meant to dismiss suffering. It is meant to liberate us from the belief that pain is an external tyrant. Marcus wanted humanity to see that the deepest source of suffering is internal, and what rises within us can be understood, regulated, and ultimately mastered. He knew that an untrained mind will create a wound before life ever touches the skin. To understand pain, we must first understand the mind that shapes it. The emperor in chains. Pain from the perspective of power. Marcus Aurelius lived with more authority than any man of his century, yet he understood something that contradicts everything we assume about power. He realized that no throne, no army, no empire can protect a person from the pain generated inside their own mind. To rule the world is one thing, to rule oneself is another, and Marcus believed the second was infinitely harder. Surrounded by political deceit, burdened by the endless demands of leadership, and weakened by chronic illness, he faced a truth most people spend their whole lives avoiding. External power does not equal internal control. The world believed him untouchable, yet Marcus wrote nightly about fear, irritation, grief, exhaustion, and the trembling uncertainty that lived beneath his public strength. What troubled him was not the chaos of Rome's borders, but the chaos of his own judgments. Here lies the paradox that defines his wisdom. The most powerful man of his age insisted that true power does not come from dominion over others, but from disciplining the interpretations within oneself. He did not deny pain. He reframed it as an internal event, something shaped by perception rather than circumstance. This single insight dissolves the illusion that life must change for suffering to ease. Marcus understood that pain begins not where the body hurts, but where the mind interprets. He saw clearly that the world can injure the flesh, but only the mind can imprison the spirit. To move forward, we must question the first prison: perception. The mind as the first wound. The Stoic theory of perception. Pain does not begin with the event. It begins with the mind's interpretation of the event. This was the foundation of Stoic psychology. and Marcus Aurelius returned to it constantly because he knew how easily a single impression could distort an entire experience. The Stoics called these impressions phantasia, the immediate mental images, judgments, and emotional colorings that arise the moment something happens. Before the truth has time to settle, the mind has already painted the moment with fear, anger, or expectation. This automatic judgment is the first wound. The sensation itself may be neutral or manageable, but the interpretation becomes a weapon turned inward. A small discomfort becomes a catastrophe. A minor loss becomes a narrative of inadequacy. A fleeting moment becomes a prophecy of doom. The mind exaggerates, predicts, dramatizes, and in doing so, multiplies suffering beyond anything the situation deserved. Modern neuroscience maps this ancient insight with precision. The brain operates as a prediction machine. Before a stimulus even reaches conscious awareness, the limbic system is already preparing a response, anticipating threat, shaping emotion, firing defensive circuits. In cognitive appraisal theory, emotion arises not from what happens, but from the meaning we assign to it. The body prepares for battle long before the mind understands what it is reacting to. This is why two people can experience the same event and suffer in completely different ways. It is not the world that determines the intensity of pain. It is the lens through which the world is interpreted. Marcus knew this deeply. He understood that without mastering perception, no amount of philosophy, discipline, or strength could grant true tranquility. If perception shapes suffering, then mastery begins with perception. What you think versus what is. The division. Marcus lived by one of Marcus Aurelius's greatest strengths was his ability to separate the event from the story he told himself about the event. This discipline became the backbone of his resilience. He reminded himself repeatedly that the mind creates unnecessary suffering when it blends fact with interpretation, sensation with fear, moment with meaning. To Marcus, clarity began with a simple question: what is actually happening right now? Everything else was judgment. This is the essence of the Stoic dichotomy of control. Marcus drew a clean line between what belongs to fate and what belongs to the will. Events, outcomes, other people, illness, fortune, and loss, these live outside our command. But the meaning we assign to them, the thoughts we choose to entertain, the actions we take in response, these remain ours completely. Awareness of this division does not eliminate pain, but it prevents suffering from becoming self-inflicted. Modern psychology reaches the same conclusion. Cognitive behavioral therapy is built on the insight that emotional distress often arises not from reality itself, but from distorted thoughts layered on top of it. The interpretation intensifies the sensation. The belief worsens the pain. A setback becomes failure. A criticism becomes rejection. A moment of discomfort becomes an identity. Marcus understood that unexamined judgments turn everyday challenges into emotional battles. He trained himself to pause before reacting, to question the first emotional impulse, and to choose a more accurate and therefore more empowering interpretation. This wasn't optimism, it was precision. Yet Marcus also knew judgment does not arise alone. It is shaped by everything that came before: memory, wounds, expectations. To understand pain fully, we must look back at what amplifies it. The echo of old wounds, how the past amplifies pain. Pain is rarely about the moment you are living. More often, it is about the moments you have not yet released. Marcus Aurelius understood that suffering intensifies when the mind responds not only to the present stimulus, but to the emotional residue of the past. A single comment can awaken the memory of years of criticism. A mild discomfort can ignite the echo of old injuries. The present becomes louder because the past has not been quieted. Daniel Goleman refers to this as emotional residue, the layers of unresolved feelings that accumulate over time, shaping perception without our awareness. These layers operate silently, yet they influence everything: what we fear, what we avoid, what we assume, and how intensely we react. The Stoics spoke about this through the lens of fantasia, explaining that impressions from the past cling to the mind and distort how we interpret new experiences. When an emotion is unexamined, it becomes a filter. Neuroscience explains this with remarkable clarity. The brain is a predictive organ. It uses memory to forecast danger. When an old emotional wound remains unresolved, the limbic system continues firing as if the original threat is still present. This is why a neutral situation can feel unbearable. The brain is not responding to now, it is responding to then. Neural circuits shaped by past fear are reactivated, intensifying suffering far beyond what the moment justifies. Marcus understood this trap. He warned himself not to revive the pain of yesterday and not to paint the present with the colors of past misfortune. He knew that suffering grows when the mind refuses to separate current reality from old memory. Pain becomes amplified not because life is cruel, but because the nervous system is repeating a pattern it never learned to release. Yet Marcus believed something powerful. The present moment can break that chain, but only if we return to it fully. Return to the present. Pain dissolves in attention. Marcus Aurelius often reminded himself that the present moment is the only place where pain can be seen clearly and therefore softened. He wrote that the mind must be restrained to the now, because the now is small, manageable, and free from the distortions of imagination. Pain grows when attention abandons the present and rushes into the realms of memory or anticipation. The moment itself is rarely unbearable. It is the story that stretches beyond it that overwhelms us. Marcus understood that returning to the present is not an escape from difficulty, but a way of shrinking suffering to its true size. When the mind stays here without dragging yesterday's anxieties or tomorrow's fears, the nervous system begins to settle. The storm loses its momentum. The body finds its breath again. Attention becomes a form of relief. Modern neuroscience confirms this intuitively simple truth. Andrew Huberman explains that attention regulates emotional intensity. When awareness narrows to what is directly in front of us, the amygdala, the brain's threat detector, reduces its activation. The prefrontal cortex regains authority. Sensations remain, but suffering decreases. Presence acts like a stabilizing weight on the mind. It pulls us back from catastrophic thinking and restores clarity to perception. This is why practices like mindfulness, controlled breathing, and grounding are effective. They interrupt the chain reaction of fear before it becomes overwhelming. They bring the mind back into alignment with the body. When you anchor yourself in the now, you stop rehearsing pain and start observing it. The difference is profound. Marcus urged himself to receive the present as it is given. He believed that pain in the present is manageable because it is real. Pain outside the present becomes monstrous because it is imagined. Returning to the moment is an act of courage, not passivity. It is the willingness to face what is, without amplifying it with what was or what might be. But presence alone is not enough. To face pain fully, a deeper strength is required, the courage to feel it. The courage to feel pain as a teacher, not a threat. Marcus Aurelius understood that avoiding pain often causes more suffering than the pain itself. He wrote that discomfort should be met not with fear, but with attention, because pain is information. It reveals where we are fragile, where we resist reality, where we cling to illusions. To Marcus, pain was not a punishment, it was training, a force that sharpened perception strengthened character, and invited greater alignment with truth. This perspective demands courage, not the loud, heroic courage celebrated on battlefields, but the quiet internal bravery of sitting with what hurts without immediately escaping into distraction or narrative. Modern psychology calls this exposure, the process of allowing ourselves to feel discomfort so the nervous system can learn that sensation is not danger. When we resist pain, the limbic system amplifies it. When we allow it, the brain begins to calm. Neuroscience supports this fully. When a person leans into an uncomfortable sensation with awareness rather than panic, dopamine systems stabilize, stress circuits de-escalate, and the prefrontal cortex regains leadership over emotional impulses. This is why therapists teach patients to breathe through anxiety attacks instead of fighting them. The act of allowing is itself an act of mastery. Marcus lived by this principle. He reminded himself that pain becomes unbearable only when we demand that it should not exist. When we stop fighting discomfort, when we acknowledge it, study it, feel it, something unexpected happens. The story around the pain begins to dissolve. What remains is the raw sensation, and raw sensation is almost always survivable. Once resistance falls away, the mind is free to see something profound, that events are neutral until we color them with judgment. The neutrality of events, removing the story from the sensation. Marcus Aurelius repeated a single idea so consistently that it became the backbone of his inner strength. Events are neutral. The world acts, things happen, the body feels sensations. But none of this is inherently good or bad. What creates suffering is the story we attach to what happens. A delay becomes a disaster. A criticism becomes a wound. A moment of discomfort becomes a prophecy of ruin. Marcus insisted that pain intensifies, not because the event grows stronger, but because the narrative grows louder. This is not denial, it is precision. Sensation is simply sensation. The mind is the narrator. When the story is removed, pain loses its inflated power. A difficult moment remains difficult, but it no longer becomes a personal tragedy. The Stoics trained themselves to make this distinction quickly. They believed that if you could experience an event without instantly labeling it, you could meet it with clarity instead of fear. Neuroscience explains this process clearly. The brain's interpretation of pain can drastically increase or decrease the intensity of the experience. When the mind labels a sensation as dangerous or catastrophic, pain circuits amplify. The amygdala fires, stress hormones spike, muscles tighten, and the body prepares for threat. But when the mind observes the same sensation without judgment, pain signaling reduces. Studies show that mindfulness, pure, judgment-free awareness, can lower perceived pain even when the physical stimulus remains the same. Marcus practiced this long before science gave it a name. He taught himself to witness sensations as they are, without the narrative overlay. This is why he wrote, "If you are distressed by anything external, the pain is not due to the thing itself, but to your estimate of it. The story is the suffering. When the story dissolves, something remarkable happens. The self is no longer tangled in the narrative. You begin to see who you are beneath the noise of interpretation. The self behind the suffering, identity without the pain." Narrative. Marcus Aurelius understood a truth most people never discover. Pain becomes far more powerful when we fuse it with identity. The moment discomfort stops being something we experience and becomes something we are, suffering deepens. Marcus saw clearly that the self is not the fear it feels, not the grief it carries, and not the pain it endures. He reminded himself constantly that identity must remain separate from sensation. Modern neuroscience illuminates why this matters. The brain's default mode network constructs a sense of self, by stitching together memories, emotions, and internal commentary. When pain becomes part of this tapestry, it begins to define the narrative. I am broken. I am weak. I am failing. These thoughts are not reflections of reality. They are echoes of neural loops, patterns shaped by past experiences and repeated often enough to feel true. Marcus refused to let temporary discomfort become a permanent identity. He saw the danger in allowing pain to rewrite the self. Instead, he treated suffering as weather passing through the mind. Intense, sometimes overwhelming, but always temporary. He believed that the true self is the observer behind the sensation, the presence that remains intact even when emotions surge. Psychology reinforces this insight. Rumination strengthens emotional circuits. Identification intensifies distress. But when a person practices cognitive diffusion, observing thoughts and feelings without merging with them, the brain shifts. The prefrontal cortex gains distance. The limbic system quiets. Pain remains, but suffering decreases. Identity expands beyond the moment. Marcus invited himself to ask, "Who am I without the story my pain is telling?" When we pose this question honestly, we recognize that the core of who we are is untouched by passing discomfort. The self is deeper than the sensation, stronger than the narrative, and more enduring than the moment. Once identity is free, agency returns, and with agency, we regain the power to choose our next action. Agency in the fire. What you can still choose pain narrows the world. It constricts attention. It convinces us that we are powerless, that nothing can be changed, that we are trapped in the sensation itself. Marcus Aurelius confronted this illusion head-on. Even in illness, betrayal, uncertainty, and exhaustion, he reminded himself of one truth. No matter what the body feels or what circumstances impose, the mind always retains a sliver of choice. And that sliver is enough to reclaim inner freedom. To Marcus, agency was not about controlling outcomes. It was about directing intention. A single breath taken with awareness, a single thought examined instead of obeyed, a single action aligned with virtue rather than impulse. These small movements, repeated consistently, form the foundation of resilience. They prove to the mind that even in the fire, you are not entirely consumed. Modern psychology echoes this through the concept of behavioral activation. When someone feels overwhelmed, depressed, or immobilized by stress, the most effective path forward is not waiting for motivation. It is movement, taking one intentional action, however small. The brain responds to behavior. When you act, neural circuits shift. When you choose, even under pressure, identity begins to rebuild. Neuroscience reinforces this power. The prefrontal cortex, the center of decision-making, discipline, and long-term thinking, activates when we make conscious choices, even in moments of discomfort. This activation calms the limbic system and reduces emotional overwhelm. A single choice becomes a signal to the entire nervous system: we are not defeated. Marcus understood this deeply. He knew that life may take much from us: comfort, certainty, control, but it cannot take our ability to decide how we meet the moment. In the darkest times, he reminded himself, the impediment to action advances action. Even the obstacle becomes fuel. But action, to be meaningful, must be guided by something stronger than impulse. It must be rooted in principle. Virtue as pain's counterweight, the Stoic architecture of strength. Marcus Aurelius believed that no one becomes strong merely by enduring hardship. Strength comes from the principles that shape how we endure. Pain by itself does not build character. What builds character is the framework through which we interpret and respond to pain. For Marcus, that framework was virtue, the four pillars that anchored the Stoic mind: wisdom, courage, temperance, and justice. These were not abstract ideals. They were tools engineered to stabilize the psyche under pressure. Wisdom begins with clarity. It is the ability to see pain without distortion, to separate the sensation from the story. Neuroscience shows that clarity reduces cognitive load and quiets emotional reactivity. When the mind understands what is actually happening, the amygdala calms. Fear loses momentum. Marcus cultivated wisdom to prevent suffering from expanding beyond the truth. Courage strengthens action. It transforms discomfort into training and fear into a call for presence. Courage activates the prefrontal cortex, overriding impulsive reactions from the limbic system. Modern studies show that deliberate exposure to manageable discomfort builds resilience. Marcus treated life's challenges as opportunities to exercise this internal muscle. Temperance regulates desire and impulse. In a world that constantly overstimulates the dopamine system, temperance protects both discipline and attention. It prevents pain from driving us into destructive coping mechanisms. Huberman notes that delaying gratification stabilizes the brain's reward circuits, fostering long-term satisfaction instead of short-term escape. Marcus relied on temperance to keep his mind from scattering under stress. Justice aligns action with meaning. Psychological research confirms that people who act according to values experience deeper fulfillment and greater emotional stability. Justice lifts us out of self-absorption and reminds us that pain becomes lighter when we serve something larger than our own discomfort. For Marcus, responsibility to others was a source of strength, not burden. When these virtues form the foundation of our behavior, pain loses its ability to dominate the mind. The world may still wound the body, but it cannot fracture the inner architecture. You become less reactive, more anchored, more aware of what truly matters. From this stability, another form of power emerges, the power of perspective. Perspective is power. How Marcus reframed everything. Marcus Aurelius understood that most suffering grows in the absence of perspective. Pain feels absolute when the mind believes it is the center of the universe. Fear becomes overwhelming when the world collapses into a narrow focus. Marcus's antidote was simple but radical. Widen your view. He reminded himself to rise above the immediate moment, to see life from a broader vantage point, to recognize that every difficulty is part of a much larger landscape. He would imagine himself looking down from above the earth, seeing armies, cities, empires, and generations passing in endless cycles. From that height, personal pain shrinks. Not because it becomes meaningless, but because it becomes contextualized. The Stoics called this the view from above, a mental practice that dissolves ego and restores proportion. When pain is placed within a wider frame, it loses its dominance over the present. Modern neuroscience confirms the effectiveness of this method. Studies show that psychological distancing, mentally stepping back from a situation, reduces amygdala activation and lowers emotional intensity. It helps the brain shift from reactive processing to reflective processing. Jordan Peterson often highlights the transformative power of adopting a broader narrative, reminding people that meaning is found not in shrinking life to avoid suffering, but in expanding perspective to endure it. Marcus practiced this constantly. When overwhelmed, he zoomed out. When frustrated, he reminded himself of the impermanence of all things. When in sorrow, he saw himself as a single thread in the vast fabric of time. This was not detachment from life. It was alignment with reality. Perspective grounded him, allowing the mind to breathe again. Yet Marcus knew that perspective alone was not enough. A person must train themselves to hold on to this clarity, even when the world becomes chaotic. The mind must become a fortress, an inner citadel capable of withstanding the storms of existence. Training the inner citadel, becoming untouchable from within. Marcus Aurelius often wrote about an inner citadel, a fortress within the mind that cannot be breached by external events. This citadel was not a metaphor for escape, but for mastery. It represented the disciplined mind, trained through repetition, awareness, and principle, that could remain steady even when life became unpredictable. Marcus knew that every moment of challenge was an opportunity to strengthen this fortress. Every irritation, every disappointment, every wave of pain was a weight he could lift to grow stronger. To build this inner citadel, Marcus practiced mental training with the same rigor that soldiers trained their bodies. He rehearsed virtue. He examined judgments. He paused before reacting. He exposed himself to voluntary discomfort. He wrote nightly, reviewing the day and refining his interpretations. This was not an intellectual exercise. It was neural conditioning. Modern neuroscience validates this approach. Neural pathways strengthen through repetition. The more often you respond to discomfort with awareness instead of panic, the more automatic that response becomes. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for clarity, discipline, and long-term thinking, becomes more dominant. The limbic system, home of fear, impulse, and emotional reactivity, becomes quieter. Over time, the brain reshapes itself to favor stability over chaos. This is the essence of emotional regulation training. Habits carve the architecture of the mind. The inner citadel is not built in a single moment of insight, but through countless small acts of discipline. Joe Dispenza describes this as breaking the neurological signatures of the past and installing new patterns aligned with who you choose to become. In this sense, the citadel is not inherited. It is built. Marcus understood that external chaos cannot penetrate a mind that has been trained to return to clarity. A storm may rage outside, but inside the citadel, there is order, there is stillness, there is sovereignty. And once this inner fortress stands strong, a person can face life with a calm that is not fragile but earned. What rises next is the peak of Stoic control, equanimity in the storm. Equanimity in the storm, the peak of Stoic control. Equanimity is not indifference. It is not numbness. It is the refined state that emerges when perception, discipline, and perspective converge into a single steady presence. Marcus Aurelius reached for this state constantly. In the midst of war, sickness, betrayal, and the crushing weight of responsibility, he sought the one form of control no external force could threaten: mastery over his inner response. To Marcus, equanimity was the mind's ability to remain whole under pressure, not detached from reality, but deeply aligned with it. He believed that a person is strongest when they no longer swing wildly between emotional extremes, when neither praise nor insult, comfort nor discomfort, fortune nor misfortune can distort their judgment. This was the highest expression of Stoic strength, steadiness. Modern neuroscience explains the mechanics of this state. Equanimity arises when the prefrontal cortex consistently regulates the limbic system. Emotional storms still appear, but they no longer command behavior. The amygdala fires, but the mind does not collapse into panic. Self-awareness, a concept Daniel Goleman places at the heart of emotional intelligence, becomes the observer that prevents emotion from becoming identity. This balance allows a person to feel deeply without losing clarity. Andrew Huberman reminds us that calm cognition, the ability to think clearly while under stress, is one of the highest forms of human performance. It is not the absence of sensation, but the presence of control. Equanimity stabilizes the nervous system, allowing both body and mind to function with precision, even in difficulty. Pain remains, but suffering does not spiral. Marcus practiced equanimity through reflection, breath, voluntary hardship, and constant self-inquiry. He trained himself to pause before reacting, to return to values when emotions surged, and to remember his insignificance within the vastness of the universe. These practices created a buffer between stimulus and response, a sacred space where wisdom, not impulse, could choose the next action. This is the peak of Stoic control, not resistance, not suppression, but steadiness. The mind rooted so deeply in its principles that no external force can uproot it. And at the core of this mastery lies the teaching Marcus repeated to himself more than any other. Suffering is a judgment. The core teaching. At the heart of Marcus Aurelius's philosophy lies a single revelation. Suffering is not contained in the event itself, but in the judgment we attach to it. This was more than a comforting idea. It was the central mechanism of Stoic mastery. Marcus knew that if he could regulate the meaning he assigned to what he experienced, he could regulate the suffering that followed. Pain might be unavoidable, but interpretation was negotiable. He wrote to himself, "If you are pained by any external thing, it is not this thing that disturbs you, but your judgment about it." This was not denial, it was awareness. The world delivers events, loss, illness, failure, discomfort, insult. But the mind delivers the narrative. And the narrative is where suffering either expands or dissolves. Marcus understood that if he could control the judgment, he could control the experience. Cognitive behavioral therapy is built on this same principle. Aaron Beck and other founders of CBT demonstrated that emotional suffering often results from distorted beliefs rather than the events themselves. Change the cognition and the emotional experience changes. Neuroscience confirms this. The brain's perception of pain is significantly shaped by expectation, belief, and appraisal. When interpretation shifts, the neural signature of pain shifts with it. Mindfulness traditions echo this truth. When a person observes a sensation without labeling it, the suffering attached to that sensation weakens. The mind learns to distinguish reality from narrative. This is exactly what Marcus practiced. He returned again and again to the raw fact of any moment, stripping away exaggeration, fear, and story until only the truth remained. Marcus knew that if suffering was a judgment, then liberation was a possibility. Change the judgment, and the chains loosen. Silence the narrative, and suffering thins. Meet reality as it is, and the mind becomes steady. And now that the teaching is understood, the path must be lived. Where pain ends and mastery begins. There is a quiet moment at the end of every struggle when something inside you shifts. Not because the world has become easier, and not because the circumstances have suddenly aligned, but because the mind has stepped out of its own shadow. Pain loses its sharpness when interpretation loses its authority. Suffering weakens when judgment is questioned. In the space between sensation and story, a new kind of freedom appears. Marcus Aurelius understood this intimately. He lived in a world of uncertainty, responsibility, and constant pressure, yet he found a steadiness that did not come from victory or comfort. It came from clarity. He learned to face life without adding unnecessary weight, to meet discomfort without magnifying it, to witness events without surrendering to the narratives that distort them. Pain was real, but suffering was optional. Modern neuroscience mirrors his insight. When the mind stops predicting and catastrophizing, when attention returns to the present, the nervous system reorganizes. The body softens, the breath steadies, the internal storm quiets. Pain becomes a signal, not a sentence. And in this quieting, the self emerges, not as a victim of its sensations, but as the observer of them. You were never meant to be ruled by your reactions. You were meant to rise above them. You were never meant to be imprisoned by your thoughts. You were meant to examine them. You were never meant to drown in suffering. You were meant to understand the judgment that created it. Finally, remember this: you suffer less the moment you interpret less. Pain ends where clarity begins, and mastery begins wherever you choose to reclaim your mind.